What's up, man?
What's good, my man? Man meet legend, Dr. Eric Helms. Always good to see you.
Always good to be on live with you. How you doing, man?
I'm doing really well. How's everything? What time do you have right there in New Zealand? Because it always messes with my head. Is it
It is
morning?
11
Okay.
a.m. on
All right.
Wednesday, the 10th of August.
Oh, so you live in the future. That's why you know so much, right?
And it is a bright future, I can tell you. So have faith. No
Oh
matter what's
man,
happening today, I can tell you tomorrow's good. So,
I really needed to hear that because with COVID and then the new disease, which you probably heard about, it gets a little tricky to carry around, right?
yep. Well, it hasn't been cured tomorrow yet, but I'm staying
But
positive. Yeah.
but slowly but surely. So as always, thanks for taking the time. I can say this enough. A huge honor, a pleasure. I always learn a lot from you, Eric. So thanks again.
No, it's an honor to be here. It's great to have the opportunity to connect with a broader audience. I always appreciate you reaching out, man. So my pleasure.
It's mind blowing, honestly. Ever since the first time we spoke, which was about, it was I think last year. It was about eating disorders. That was the first talk we had.
Mm.
It blows my mind to reach out to you and then you reply and you agree. It's like, wow. I've been reading your books, your articles. I've been subscribed to Mass for so long, and being able to speak to you, it's truly an honor for me, really.
Well, this is I think we could continue on this path for a long time, telling each other that the honor is ours, dueling pleasantries, and I will happily do it. But no, man, I greatly appreciate that. So, and I'm glad to hear it.
Very well. So the topic at hand, I think is one of those, let's say, unicorns of a topic, which is speaking for bodybuilding, because, at least here in Mexico, it's the stuff of legends. Some people get dehydrated. Some people speed all day to get dehydrated. Some people drink wine. You hear all sorts of crazy stories, but I wanted to start by actually defining what is the purpose of a peak week. Is it really necessary for every bodybuilder that steps on stage, or it's maybe just a little nitty gritty aspect of it?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because the first time I read anything about peaking, it wasn't like most things you might characterize as quote unquote like bro science. It was heavily laden with references in physiology. When you read stuff even that was written in the 80s and 90s, they're talking about the sodium potassium pump, intercellular to extracellular water ratios, um, the entire system that regulates water balance, so antidiuretic hormone, and how that interacts with electrolytes, and then how does that interact with appearance, citing the earliest research on carbohydrate loading and endurance athletes, and all the various ways to improve that. And so I was always found that very fascinating. But as I've gotten into the science more and more and more, I've come to realize just how much of that is very much a house of cards. You know, um, there's something that I like to say that the confidence and the specificity of your recommendations should match the confidence and the specificity of the research, or the evidence, I should say. And that includes anecdotal evidence in the trenches experience, things like that, logic. So there's I understand why we have mechanisms built on theories, built upon physiology, and this very, very complex structure of what do people do or what do bodybuilders do to peak, to look their best, to get on stage. Because it's not like we have research in the 70s, like we do on endurance athletes, that shows how does carbohydrate loading affect appearance? How does dehydration affect appearance? So it's one of those interesting things that has always sort of been quote unquote evidence based, but operating in a space where we don't actually have direct evidence. Um, and that also meshes with the anecdotal experiences of bodybuilders and kind of a shared cultural experience to get what we call the peak week process. And the purpose of the peak week is basically to look your best on game day, on stage. And the basic theories behind it that are typically discussed, at least traditionally discussed, are that we want to make the muscles larger and we want to make the subcutaneous space thinner so that we can highlight definition and look both full and ripped. Some people might call that quote unquote dry,
Right.
which just goes to show you how baked in the idea of dehydration is, which you brought up, spitting, or cutting water, or increasing potassium and decreasing sodium, or something like that. All these various ways to try to shed water are really common in bodybuilders. And I would say they've remained very common on the enhanced side of the sport. And in the, at least I could speak for like the more science focused, non-enhanced side of the sport, those practices have changed a lot in the last 15 years. Cutting water has become less common. Electrolyte manipulation has become less common. Um, and that's interesting because it's not like you're seeing athletes not get in good shape, these days or anything like that.
Right.
So, so anyway, the actual research on this, like direct research, like let's manipulate these variables to see how it impacts circumferences of muscles or limbs, I should say, um, muscle thickness, skin fold thickness, or actually look at things like intracellular to extracellular water balance. That's really only happened since the 90s and very sporadically. So what we know from research and what we know from observation and then and experience and then what we theorize don't all fully connect. So this is to some degree something that is um, not fully explored. I don't know if it ever will be fully explored. I can tell you as a researcher, one of the hardest things to do is go up to very dedicated athletes who've been, you know, everything's betting on the line a week from now. And you go, can I mess with your peak week? Do you
Yeah,
mind if
yeah,
I do?
totally.
I know you're doing the Olympia in a week, but let me see if this counts. Um, so that's not easy to do. And some of the research that's come out is what I would describe as quasi-experimental, where you're not necessarily controlling all the variables, but you're observing people who are doing things, and then you're separating them based upon what they're doing, but you're not experimentally changing it, and then you're making comparisons there. So that might be as good as it gets, or some limited elements of experimental designs. I've actually got a student right now here at AUT. His name's Kai Homer. Shout out. And he is doing his master's thesis specifically looking at manipulating carbohydrate loading and seeing how it impacts performance and appearance. And we're actually going to have judges look at pictures with the face blacked out of the same athlete after a carb load or not a carb load and see if how they rate the two compared to one another. So it's not that it can't be done; it's just hard, So we'll be doing like a crossover design. People have to be pretty damn lean. Like what we did is we found studies where they looked at the sum of skin folds in competitors on stage, and we're going, okay, you've got to be within a standard deviation of that, and you need to have been dieting, not just someone who's naturally lean, and you need to be resistance trained. So it will include some competitors, but it'll also just include some people who are dieting, get pretty lean and lift weights, and we try a peak week protocol on them. But it's logistically challenging to do a study like this, and getting enough sample size to make inferences that can apply to the broader population of people who might be doing this is also another hurdle to be cleared. But there is research being done. Like there was a couple recent studies that came out just this year and last. One was an observational study of 11 competitors who did things like, whatever they did for peak week.
That
And
yeah,
then,
that
yeah.
no, sorry
So it
to
wasn't
interrupt. That's the one you reviewed on mass, right? The intracellular or extracellular water.
I did, yeah. It came out actually early this year
Right.
by Nunez and colleagues, and yeah. So they just basically what happened from the day prior to the day of, and they looked at some anthropometrics, and they also um, they tried to measure is probably the most favorable way to, or the most accurate way to put it, intracellular extracellular water ratios. But unfortunately, they used a single frequency BIA device. So the
Right.
reason why that matters, and maybe like, all right, science. So the way that you can differentiate between different body water compartments by using any type of impedance measurements is you use multiple frequencies so that the frequency passes through only one tissue but not another. So a single frequency can't differentiate between different body water compartments because there's only one frequency. So the frequency needed to penetrate, say, the extracellular versus the intracellular layer, they're not the same. So you have to have a multi-frequency device, so which is called BIS versus BIA. So multi-frequency bioimpedance spectroscopy is what you need to have to actually assess that. So what they did in the Nunes study with these 11 bodybuilders who were kind enough to, on competition day, get some circumference measurements and do a handheld to foot BIA scale, was they had to use estimation equations. But we're talking about errors of like 4 liters of water, and that's assuming it was in a controlled condition and assuming that the equation you used matches the population. But the population was like bodybuilders, not even necessarily natural in this competition. And the equation is based upon like team sport athletes, like soccer players and other types of athletes. So the errors are probably even higher than 4 liters because you need to have like controlled nutrition to have like one day compared to another day, controlled hydration, and to be fasted for 8 hours. And that's literally the opposite of everything that these people were doing. They're manipulating their water, they're manipulating their food, and they're not going to go 8 hours without eating. So I think the Nunes study is, I'm not going to say fatally flawed, but I think it is really, really difficult to assess whether or not these bodybuilders actually modified their inter to extracellular water ratios with the things they did. And even if it, let's say it could assess that, these 11 people might have done 11 different things, And there was also no rating of appearance. So, okay, I did manipulate my intracellular to extracellular water ratio, but was that a good thing? So
Right.
there's still a lot of work to be done. And shout out to Chris Barakat, Grant Tinsley, Scott Stevenson, and their team. There's a recent pilot study that was actually on Chris Barakat. I think he's publicly stated that, like his peak. They recently published that, but that's an N of 1, and so it was interesting. There's some stuff we could discuss there. I'll be reviewing that in mass as well. But yeah, there's some work is being done to try to catalog like what happens when people do this stuff. And then like I said, Kai, we're doing some work to see, okay, what if we isolate one of these variables like carbohydrate loading and see what happens. And there's the quasi-experimental stuff. And then there's research going all the way back to the 90s where there's some observational and experimental work, but it's a tough nut to crack because there is differing anecdotes. When you have battling anecdotes, what do you rely on? You could take 2 different people who know physiology and they could construct a well-cited, protocol for you that would be totally opposite of one another. To be honest, like I can go through that if that'd be fun, just so I can break people's brains. Like if you know science well enough, you can cite things that are directly contradictory and they both seem evidence-based, So, which is why, again, you have to have the confidence and the specificity of your recommendations match the confidence and specificity of the science that exists and the evidence that exists. So anyway, that was a long ramble on my part, but there, I opened the can of worms and we can go where you
Man,
want.
please go on, man. I'm all delighted. But as you said, when you start digging and digging and digging, it's a house of cards because, for instance, that study that Nunez studied, intracellular and extracellular water, maybe bodybuilders, we think, okay, intracellular water, we think muscle, right? But it's not like it's the only cell in the body. Extracellular, what about the pump? Like you said, I think it was in the review or maybe in the podcast you did in the best episode of Stronger by Science. Let me say, isn't it the pump a good thing? So why wouldn't we wanting that? And also, in regards to anecdote, maybe more on the old school side of things. Why on earth would people want to be dehydrated when muscle is compromised of maybe 70% water? What would be the sense of it? And as you said, it's like the most scientific, quote unquote, aspect of bodybuilding, the big wig, the manipulation, the all the, let's say, science that goes behind it, but on what is it based, right? And how do you study such a difficult topic? Like the same Nunez study, or like I think I have it right here, Moraes, the depletion and carb loading.
Yep.
because there's a lot of things to discuss on that one. And I think to give it a little bit of a of a structure, is it okay if we start with carbohydrate manipulation and then we jump to water and sodium manipulation?
Sure. Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
as far as the evidence we have, I think carbohydrate is the it's a little bit more solid, right?
It is. Yeah. So the first study that was done, I believe, was by Ballin in the early 90s or the late 90s. I can't remember if it was 92 or 99. Probably doesn't matter for the context. But this was a study where they actually took normal body fat, resistance trained men, and what they did was they modified their carbohydrate to fat ratio. So they put them on like a very low fat, very high carb diet, or a very low carb, very high fat diet, and then they just measured circumferences and girths. And they saw did eating higher carbohydrate as a portion of total calories have any modification? And it didn't. And their conclusion was that bodybuilders are silly. Carbohydrate loading doesn't work. Um, and they were studying this in the 90s because it was popular enough to be, anecdotally something that people talked about and something that all bodybuilders did and still do, I'll note, even back then. And the reason why is because the majority of carbohydrate is stored in muscle as muscle glycogen. And carbohydrate is osmotic, so it draws water to it. So you've probably heard, or many people have heard, the statement that for every 1 gram of stored glycogen, it's stored with 3 grams of water, and that's stored intracellularly in the muscle, makes your muscles look bigger, and that's the general idea. This is something most people have probably observed if they've dieted versus not, and or had refeed days. So it's something that is anecdotally very common, like, oh, I look bigger when I eat X, Y, and Z or whatever. Um, and it's something that the majority of bodybuilders practice based upon even just the surveys we have now, 2019, even 20 years plus after this study was conducted. So the study didn't change practice, and I think the reason is it's not really an accurate representation of the position people are in bodybuilding. It is actually hard to deplete muscle glycogen without doing muscular work, and it's hard to deplete glycogen in general without actually being in a calorie deficit. Um, it will happen to some degree if you go on a low carb diet and then resistance train or do exercise even without changing your calories. But you'd be surprised at how good the body is at using other fuels and substrates and converting things. And there is actually some interesting data on quote unquote fat adapted endurance athletes who their muscle glycogen levels are not they're not lower than you'd expect. So I think for one, there's a difference between someone who's dieted for 12 to 36 weeks and is on a low calorie and low carbohydrate diet, who's been carb loading, who's 5% body fat as a male or 10% body fat as a female, for example, versus someone who is 15% body fat as a male and last week just shifted their carbs and fat around but still ate the same amount of calories. So I think the external validity of that study was lacking in a pretty substantial way to where we probably can't rely on it. And it doesn't match the observational research that we had at that time. Like there's a study by Bauman and colleagues where they observed significant increase. This is just an observational study of competitive bodybuilders back in the 90s. And they saw that their bicep thickness increased, or is their circumference, I can't remember which, on the day of the competition. So they probably did just like, I had a really great session and I made some gains. I gained a half a kilogram of muscle tissue in
Right.
the last 2 days while I'm starved.
Were
Probably
they
not.
were they natural bodybuilders?
I don't think so.
Right.
This was, I believe, is an NPC competition, if I recall correctly, or the equivalent back in the 90s, which I think was still NPC. So it was pretty high level. So the fact was that whatever these bodybuilders did in the final day, prior to getting on stage compared to the last week, it made their bicep measurement increase. And it was stated in that manuscript that they were using some of these quote unquote peaking protocols. So the observational data has been there for 30 years. The anecdotes have been there, as far as I know, 30 or 40 years from everything I've read and all the historical stuff I've read and talking to old school guys and gals. Um, but we didn't really have like solid research until, like you mentioned, Desmarais in 2019. That's the quasi-experimental study where what they did was they went to this bodybuilding competition and they asked people to report their protocol, what they did with carbohydrate,
Mm.
and then they took photos of them, which they turned into silhouettes so that they couldn't be identified. And they sent silhouettes of the group that had less than 5 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate in their peak week protocol, or I believe 10. I think people who basically carb loaded or didn't, and the average was like 5 grams per kg or 10 grams per kg. And they were rated as significantly larger or better looking, better silhouettes, which is still a limited measurement. Like maybe they spilled over, and you wouldn't have picked that up in the silhouette. But the silhouettes were rated better by the bodybuilding judges in the carbohydrate loading group, and there were also increases in size. So this was like the first time we're like, oh shit, it looks like carbohydrate loading works. And a cool thing that, this is just more observational data that kind of corroborates this. The cool thing about that recent case study that was published by Barakat and colleagues that just came out last month is in figure 1, what they did was they plotted changes in muscle thickness against carbohydrate intake, and they followed a really similar trajectory. And it was a cool relationship. And I think the R score, or sorry, Kendall's tau, which is a non-parametric relationship, it's interpreted the same way as like an R score from -1 to +1, with -1 being a perfect inverse relationship like an X, like as one goes up, the other one goes down, and a 1 being 2 perfectly aligned lines of 0.733. And it was nearly significant. And what they did is they just looked at all the different days from 9 days out to comp day. And it kind of follows this pattern of like, as carbs go down, muscle thickness goes down. As carbs go up, muscle thickness goes up. Then it does this little dip. So they track almost perfectly. And it seems to show like, yeah, there's a direct relationship with muscle thickness and carbohydrate intake in this study. We saw it in Desmarais' observational study. We see it in other observational research on bodybuilders, and everyone anecdotally, not everyone, the majority of people anecdotally notice the difference between fullness and flatness with carbohydrates. So I think that's really interesting. Now to dovetail from carbohydrates to how that interacts with the rest of the peaking process.
Mostly water, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Because exactly, no, you're right. Because of that osmotic effect, the traditional dogma is that okay, so we load carbohydrates, right? Keep water normal, keep electrolytes normal, and then later we drop sodium and we cut water to try to increase water excretion. But don't worry, you'll be protected from flattening out because we have these 3 grams of water that are bound with every gram of glycogen. So muscle fullness protected, and it'll be preferentially taken away from extracellular sources, which, like you mentioned, people think of that as the subcutaneous layer, but extracellular is a lot of shit, including the entire vascular system. And likewise, intracellular is also a lot of shit, and not just inside your muscle.
I'm sorry, I just want to say it's
space in muscle. Like, so, yeah.
It's not just muscle and skin and that's it, right?
It'd be nice if it was.
Yeah.
I guess bone. Bone is needed too. Yeah. Everything else just not necessary though. So the traditional dogma is you have this carbohydrate loading phase, and then you have this kind of quote unquote drying up phase, right? And you preserve your fullness because you loaded carbohydrate. You drop the water, you get tight. You drop all the excess water specifically from the extracellular, aka subcutaneous space, even though they're not an AKA, and you look amazing. But there's, and I could create citations there to support all of that. That is the way the sodium potassium pump works. That's the way that the body excretes water, and that is in fact the ratio of the required amount of water for restored gram of glycogen. However, I think that 3-to-1 ratio should be seen as a minimum. So there's actually this really cool study by Fernandez Elias that was done in 2015, where they took endurance athletes, right, and they put them on this glycogen depleting cycling protocol, and they did muscle biopsies after in 2 different conditions. They fed them carbohydrate after the cycling bout in both cases to get rapid glycogen replenishment, but in one case they didn't give them any fluids. So they kept them dehydrated. They sweated a lot, they worked, and they said, here's just carbohydrates, no fluids. And in the other condition, they hydrated them fully. They gave them a ton of fluids in addition to all this carbohydrate. And get this, yeah, they observed a 3-to-1 ratio of
Right.
water grams to carbohydrate grams in the dehydrated group. But when they looked at the biopsies for the hydrated group, it was a 17-to-1 ratio. So
17.
17,
They,
so
they
nearly
were
a six-fold difference,
right.
right? So, and this is a biopsy. This isn't looking at the subcutaneous layer. So this is showing that being severely dehydrated, even when you are carbohydrate loaded, can substantially impact your muscle fullness. And that is definitely something I've observed is, despite someone having loaded carbohydrates, if they go too crazy with water, they sometimes can look flat. They can struggle to get a pump. And there's also problems with some of the mechanisms by which people try to dry out that are not just related to, you know, water restriction. So some of the electrolyte manipulations. Yes, sodium tends to draw water to the extracellular, potassium tends to draw to the intracellular, but this is a very tightly regulated system. If it wasn't, we would just have heart failure, like quite easily. So
Just
that's
like that. Wow.
seriously, like, yeah, this is something where the body is very good at regulating to the minute our water ratios, and it can't change very much. You'll never see it change very much because it would cause death. Um, so some of the mechanisms that are used. So if you drop your sodium and you increase your potassium, your body will work very hard to preserve a physiologically functional level of hydration in the right tissues. And the few deaths we've seen in bodybuilding, acute deaths due to what someone has taken, have been related to prescription diuretics, which can actually overcome these
Right.
homeostatic methods. Andreas Munzer is one example, but he's not the only one, where you see heart failure or kidney failure due to really messing with our normal water balance. But the idea is, you feel like shit, it's okay, but that's fine, but you're looking better and it's cost of doing business. But I'm not sure that's true. Um, I really actually question the idea that a higher intracellular to extracellular water ratio is necessarily associated with looking fuller and more peaked. Because if you think about it, like if you go to the gym right now and you like start pumping up, you're literally increasing the extracellular water in your bicep. You're getting more blood flow there, and there's blood pooling, and you're getting more delivered in the muscle, and it's staying. It's in some cases it's intramuscular, but it's extracellular, but your arm looks better, right?
Yeah, you're blowing
So,
my mind, man. I haven't
right?
thought of it
So
like
it's
that.
yeah, like when you get a pump and you look better, you just worked out. That is like when you have a little bit of edema in your muscle, right? Like
Right.
muscle damage and your muscle looks bigger from training yesterday. I mean, sometimes it blurs definition, but sometimes you just look better, and that's all extracellular. So it's
Totally.
it's an interesting thing. And when you manipulate electrolytes, other things happen, right? So we know from the Rossau 2013 case study on, I think it was the first of the modern era natural bodybuilding research studies that were done. This is the 2013 case study, natural pro bodybuilder, and his blood pressure, I think, went from like systolic of 130 down to like 108 over the course of contest prep, if I remember correctly. So like, 20, it dropped by about 20.
Right.
And we also have research showing that not necessarily in all people or all ethnicities or to a large degree, but that manipulating sodium can acutely change blood pressure. So an increase in sodium can make your blood pressure go up at least acutely. Dropping it can make it go down acutely. So the idea of taking someone who's already gone from a normotensive to hypotensive, a low blood pressure, and then going, we're going to restrict your sodium, that seems like a great way to really drop their blood pressure and reduce their ability to get a pump and reduce the delivery of fluids to muscles when they're trying to. And I can't tell you how many times I've been backstage, either as a coach or an athlete, and certain people are like, Coach, I can't catch a pump. I don't know what it is. I can't catch a pump. And in many cases, those people, from my observations, have either cut water or they've manipulated sodium to decrease it. So I think, and more than that, also actually the GLUT4 transporter in the gut is a sodium dependent channel. So
Right.
if you cut sodium severely while you're carb loading, not that that's typically what people do, you can slow down the process of actually getting carbohydrate to your muscle, and probably increase the likelihood of having GI distress and cramping and bloating in the abdomen. And that is also another common thing that if you talk to people who run the traditional peak week, they run into a lot of GI distress. So those are the two common symptoms, like GI distress, being lightheaded, and muscle cramps. And then I even know some people who go through this peaking process and they actually take supplements to deal with those expected side effects. And I'm thinking, like, muscle cramping tells you that you're going to have a really tough time posing, and that your electrolyte balance in your muscle is messed up to the point where you can't contract right. What makes you
Right.
think that's going to be associated with looking good? GI distress while you're trying to avoid bloating and water retention in the stomach, that's probably not a good idea. And yeah, so the fact that people go through all of this to try to look better, to some degree, I think it's heavily built on dogma. But I also think that there's probably something going on the enhanced side of the fence, because it is just as it's pretty damn ubiquitous that people do elements of drying out on the enhanced side of the sport. And I think I like it's easy for me as a natural guy in my observations when I've been to probably 100 drug-free shows, but I've only been to like 3 or 4 enhanced shows, and I've never prepped someone all the way and done their peak week to stage who's enhanced. So when you think about what's going on when you're taking hormones, they're called AAS for a reason, anabolic androgenic steroids, so you're getting conversion into estrogen. If you're taking growth hormone, there's going to be a lot of water retention. If you're messing with multiple drugs and stacking them, especially at high doses, if you're a very high level enhanced bodybuilder, I'm not sure that your blood pressure does drop, and I'm also not sure that, and it might be that the ability to maintain your muscle hydration is easier. You can handle more carbohydrates, like with insulin and all this stuff. So it may be that the net effect of some of these protocols and someone on certain drugs at certain dosages and doing polypharmacy is positive. It's also probably more unpredictable. So I've tried to become less dogmatic when I think about this on the enhanced side, because I just don't have the experience. But on the natural side, I'm relatively confident that the traditional approach is neutral at best and potentially harmful in more cases than not, just because I've seen it so many times. I've seen people who drink more water and load sodium on game day and look amazing and win, and that is kind of that's our default, is we give people a little bit of sodium before being on stage. We make sure that their water is high enough so they're peeing clear on game day, and we load carbs, and we don't do a whole lot else, and especially if someone's in shape, that pretty reliably makes them look amazing, and you just have to tailor the timing and the magnitude of those variables to that person. So yeah, it's crazy to me that those are two different protocols. Like, hey, blood pressure drops, so we need to keep sodium up, and also we want to make sure that your muscles are totally full, so we want to we want to have a lot of water, and any excess water, guess what the effect of drinking a lot of water is? Excreting more water. So it's kind of like having your cake and eating it too. You're making sure that you're not retaining any more water than you normally would. And you're also making sure that you're nice and full, both from a water and carbohydrate perspective. We're making sure you can catch a pump, and we're not flushing out all your sodium because our water's nice and high. And we're going to load a little bit of sodium so that we can hopefully have the highest blood pressure we can as a dieted, shredded person. And that approach is the polar opposite to, all right, we're going to load a lot of carbohydrates, and then we're going to restrict sodium and cut water so that we can maintain fullness and look great on game day. And both of them could have citations all the way through and be a plan presented. And I think the average bodybuilder would look at that and just be like, oh, this is dueling science. I don't understand it. But it may be because the enhanced side of the sport has different requirements than the natural side. I don't know.
And that's actually what I wanted to ask you about your personal experience as a coach, because the terminology we use, spilling over, being full, maybe it's kind of sketchy. Just before you see it, I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but in research, it's, like you mentioned, it's tough to measure those things, intracellular, extracellular. But how does that leaves us as coaches, as athletes, that knowing if you're spilling over, if you're already full, how can you tell? Could you share a little bit of your own personal experience as a coach and also as an athlete?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's generally a couple of different things that you could observe, and there is also some confounders which make it difficult to distinguish between them because whether you are flat, which means you don't have enough carbohydrates and potentially water in you to have your muscles look full, or whether you are spilled over, meaning that you have exceeded your capacity to store glycogen. And what we think is happening is that these osmotic, you know, carbohydrate molecules are throughout the body, but not stored yet because they can't be, or they're in the process of being stored, and they're drawing water to them, and that includes the subcutaneous layer, and it makes you look blurry. In either case, your definition is poorer. You know, if you think about, like just a balloon that's only partially deflated, it's not as stretched and doesn't look as big. That's being flat. But also, if you took a balloon and then you put a layer of something else over it, you wouldn't be able to see the balloon as well, right? So the way you distinguish between being full and flat when they both just make you look less defined is, do you look small, right? Like your silhouette, basically. Like do your
Right.
muscles pop in the same way? Um, are your like thinner sheaths of muscle that's easy to identify? Like if you look at the abs and they look, less defined, but you're and they don't look like watery or kind of spill over from bloating, which sometimes does happen as well. That's a good sign you're flat. If like your ab separation has gotten poorer. Um, and there's some other muscle groups where you can get a decent assessment of it, but it's pretty individual. Spilled over is the tough one because when you're spilled over, you lose definition in some places, but not everywhere, depending on how bad you're spilled. And it's also a temporary look, right? So
Right.
being spilled over is often the goal that I want to see with my athletes on like Friday night before a Saturday morning competition. So, because I know, okay, we've probably loaded enough, right? But we've got 8 hours of you going to sleep, and you're going to pee. For, when you wake up, your water balance is going to normalize. The carbohydrate that's not yet been stored is going to have some time. As you know, you just burn calories through your sleep or whatever, and it gets converted to whatever needs to get converted to. So we don't just walk around with like glucose floating in our subcutaneous space for very long, right? So, so I think the, the typical goal I have is I start loading someone early on, and I'd like to see them within a day or so of the competition looking pretty full and potentially even losing definition, because then we have time to then kind of back off and go on a more moderate approaches to maintain that look. And I know that water balance is always going to come towards homeostasis. Like that's just the way the body works, right? So yeah, I typically like if I had one weird trick that works for almost everybody is feed them enough so that they spill over around like 8 or 9 p.m. And then I know that in the morning, there's a really good chance they're going to be looking better so long as we maintain high water so that there's not super higher than normal, but I want frequent clear urinations or clearish. And I want to be making sure we're eating roughly at maintenance with a fair amount from carbohydrate and fat on game day. Knowing that we're not going to move the needle much on game day, we just don't want to disrupt anything because of the time course it takes. It can take like 24 to 48 hours to fully replenish glycogen. So what you eat on game day actually matters a lot less than people think, except you just don't want to try to stuff a whole bunch of stuff in and getting back to that kind of spilly look again.
Right. Totally.
Um, yeah, and actually, I want to give a quick shout out to Cliff Wilson. There's a terminology he uses which I really like called a load look, and you can get the look of being spilled over even when your muscles aren't full of glycogen because you've exceeded, at least theoretically, it's what we think is happening. You're exceeding the rate at which glycogen can be stored, right? So let's say you can store 1,000 grams of carbohydrates. If I give you 1,000 grams right now, like just in one meal, and you eat it super fast, or you drink, like 3 liters of like Gatorade or whatever, super saturated with glucose, it's going to take some time to store, you know?
Right.
There's gastric emptying, all this stuff. And during that period where your body is going, oh shit, huge rush of food, let me assimilate it all, you look worse, right? You're going to feel there's going to be gut distension, GI distress, and there's going to be because you're exceeding the rate at which glycogen can be stored. But it all will eventually be stored. you have this kind of spilled look before you're full. So sometimes, and early in my career, I couldn't tell if I was spilled over or flat because I was actually both because of some dumb shit I was doing.
How's that?
I was, yeah, I was trying to load over too short of a
Right,
period at too
right.
fast of a rate, taking in, like sodium, water, and a lot of carbohydrates all at once. I haven't filled out yet, but I look worse. So I'm, small and spilled over. So it's one of those things that's not a big deal if it's happening on Thursday and Friday, but you don't want it to happen on game day, which is why we typically take a more moderate approach on game day of, let's keep things level, eat roughly at maintenance, have a little bit of, sodium and carbs before you go on stage so you can handle a long posing period just from an energetic perspective, maintain a high blood pressure, and you're good to go. And that's why typically in the old school approach on the enhanced side, the drying out phase is basically Friday and Saturday, you know. So that's where, they're trying to deal with excess water retention that may be more than we'd experience on the natural side because of the other things they're doing. And they may notice a net benefit, even though they're trying to overall dehydrate themselves. They might have been at what we would consider like a hyperhydrated state all the time. So if there's more retention in intercellular and extracellular and subcutaneous, all the spaces we're talking about. So a net dehydration effect brings them back to a drier place, which is maybe a little closer to what normal should be, which is when they probably look better. And that's my hypothesis as to why both of these polar opposite approaches seem to work really well, but in different populations of bodybuilders. But it is just a hypothesis.
And for instance, in the carb loading aspect, do you think the previous information you gathered from, let's say, refits, can we think of the carb loading as a refit, really? Because in the, I don't recall the name, but it was by Chris Barakat, it's Guillermo Escalante, and also Scott Stevenson, and I think Alan Aragon, the evidence-based liquid recommendations. It was a range of something like 4 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram. It's quite the range. So I
Big
guess
range.
it's a big range, so it's a little confusing. How do you manage the carbohydrate intake? Do you go by the historical data you gather from, let's say, refits?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the reason why that range is so big is because you have wildly different energy expenditures, even with people of the same body weight, even within the same population of bodybuilders. A great example is Alberto. He just has Alberto Nunez. He's really high
Mm.
meat, and as a middleweight or a heavy lightweight, depending on his stage weight and the way the cutoffs compare to me as a light heavyweight or a heavyweight who's light on the lighter end of the cutoff. Nonetheless, basically, I compete around 180. He competes around 160. 20-pound difference between us. His dieting macros or his energy intake are my off-season energy intake, just to compare, just to show how different things can be between individuals. So the grams per kilogram range is largely dictated by, like we think of it as, oh, it's just the amount of, like, how much space do I have in my muscles for carbohydrate? And you should eat that much. But we're forgetting that a huge proportion of the carbohydrate we eat is constantly being turned over for energy. So we have to get to, all right, well, what is our maintenance energy intake? And then make sure that we have a substantial proportion of carbohydrate, which is why that range is so large.
Right.
So the way you do that, because you've been paying attention to maintenance the whole diet for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, is you do it as a proportion of their normal intake. So like, let's say you've got low days, 5 days a week, at say 120 grams of carbohydrates, and then you have 2 refeed days at say 300 grams of carbohydrates. So those refeed days are supposed to be close to maintenance in most cases, or at least I'd recommend they are. And from there, you can go, okay, well, what do I need to actually get to the point where we're starting to store more glycogen than we normally would, quote unquote, super compensating, and you experiment with it. So I think a great way to do that is to alter your refeed schedule. I like to have, not necessarily always, because it's very much personal preference and what facilitates the easiest diet and the best training during the dieting process. But I like to put someone so they have back-to-back refeed days, at least when we get close to competition when they're pretty lean, because then we can see how much did they fill out from having these 2 refeed days back to back, and at what point did they look their best. And then you can experiment a little more the next week. Like, all right, let's go from 2 days at 300 to 2 days at 350. Did you spill over? You know, one thing, credit to Brad Loomis, one of the other coaches at 3D&J, what he does is he actually, at some point, purposely spills somebody. So he'll keep bumping those refeeds until he sees a spillover during
Right.
prep, if they're lean enough already, so it doesn't get in the way of the diet. And then he has pictures saved of what they look like spilled over, what they look like on low days flat, and a few spaces in between, so that he then refers back to that when he peaks them. So 100%, you can use the refeed process to manipulate and individualize like, when does your load look fade? Like, some people, it takes a while before they start looking normal again. So we might actually get our loading all done on Thursday, and I want you to look great on Thursday night, because it takes all the way through Friday before you look better, and then we just maintain it on Saturday. That's pretty rare, but it happens. Other people just seem to have like a direct relationship. Like, they're just really good at getting rid of substrate. You load them, they look better within, hours afterwards. So you might keep loading even on to a little bit in the morning, or have them eat a really late meal. I don't like to mess with people's sleep, but sometimes that's what you need to do, depending on what time they get on stage and what time they go to bed, et cetera, et cetera. So absolutely. And when you have somebody who's not quite in shape yet, and they've got multiple shows to do, and you want them to look their best, but you don't want to interfere with the diet, sometimes what you do is you just manipulate the refeeds without actually changing them at all. So they're just not flat when they get on stage. Instead of saying, you know what, we're going to add an extra day and add 50 grams of carbohydrates to both those days and the extra day, and we're only going to really have, a couple days to be in a deficit this week, just to look better at a warm-up show when you're not in
Right.
shape, it doesn't make sense, right? So normally in those cases, it makes more sense just to kind of restructure the same calorie intake so that you can be a little fuller at a certain time of the week, but not sacrificed in that deficit. So yeah, absolutely. Using the current dieting or nonlinear dieting approach that we often do can be really helpful for individualizing a peak week.
Man, again, my mind blown time after time. It's such an interesting topic because all of that implies and that strategy of Loomis. I've never heard of it, and I think it's really clever. Knowing how does it look to be spilled over, it's like, oh, it makes all the sense in the world. Why haven't I thought of that before, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, they just kind of get tunnel vision on, I got to get shredded, and
Sure.
having even just one day where they're in a large surplus, and also dealing with the psychological effect of looking worse, that's
Right.
hard. But I mean, you got an experienced competitor, you got a coach guiding you who's done it before. You're getting ready well in advance of the time frame. That's a great time to do that. But I think some people, it would be too stressful to implement. So yeah.
In regards to stress, if you have the time, of course, because it's almost been an hour. I think I felt like five
Yeah, no
minutes.
worries.
I wanted to ask you about training in regards to training and stress because it's also mentioned in the Chris's paper about muscle damage that muscle damage can actually interfere with glycogen loading
Yep.
and also just the stress because you're already a stressed person that's been eating, let's say, 100 calories for months, and then you give more training stress, more cardio. How do you manage with your athletes and yourself as an athlete, your training? I think like the comparison between the big week in regards to nutrition and refits, I tend to think about it as a deload. Training is just a deload perhaps, or maybe just rest, not even a deload. How do you tend to manage training during peak week?
Yeah, I tend to make it a little easier than normal, but not super substantially different. Um, and
But still
this is,
still weight training?
yep, definitely
Right.
still weight training during peak week. Um, and this is again relative to what they're doing during prep, which is typically a little less stressful than what they do in the off season anyway. If we're like all the way to the point they're getting on stage, so more often than not, they're doing 70 to 80% of the volume they might do in the off season, and then we just don't do exercises that are likely to induce a lot of muscle damage. So basically, where you have the highest tension point at the point of the highest muscle stretch during the eccentric phase, like an RDL,
Right.
or you're talking about like a heavy fly or something like that. So, and another thing is not doing any unaccustomed movements. So we're not going to like Have you done incline curls in the last year? No, let's do it on Friday. No, we're not going to do that. So yeah, so we would avoid anything that would exacerbate muscle damage for the reasons that you mentioned. In addition, the soreness just makes it harder to pose. Um, and depending on the individual, what they train in the last like 2 days can be very modifiable. So some people, they look less defined after they trained for the day after. Some people look better. Like off days is when they notice they don't look their best. So we've literally had some clients who train on the morning of the day of the show. It's rare, and do a sometimes people I've had people do full bodies and training sessions, including like hack squats on the day of the show. Again, not common,
Right.
but this is one of those things that you can also observe. How do you look in response to training acutely? But overall, what we're trying to do is create a training week that just doesn't have a ton of stress related to it, physical or mental. And then a lot of the times, people are traveling to shows. So like, in drug-free bodybuilding, you're typically taking a polygraph on Thursday or Friday, and you're competing on Saturday. So a lot of people, it just doesn't make sense to plan training on like the last, especially Friday, and sometimes not Thursday as well, just because it's logistically a challenge. They have to get their color at some point, sometimes Thursday or Friday as well. And if you're trying to sweat and train and touch equipment when you have color on, it's best to try to basically get most of your training done on like Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Thursday morning, and then just get like a really brief pump up on Thursday,
Right.
Friday at most. And that is going to be individually defined based upon whether they had to travel, where they're staying, is it a populated area or not? Do they have access to transportation, or would they have to be Ubering all over the place? And how does that affect the competitor? How experienced are they? And then how do they seem to respond visually to training acutely? So those are the typical options, but I've rarely seen any downside to taking the mindset of less is more. I have seen coaches who really think like you got to do at least like a pump up on each day of the last few days, or your glycogen doesn't know where to go. But I don't think that time course
Yeah.
is accurate. It's not going to mess up your carbohydrate load, or you're not going to lose muscle fullness if you take 2 days off from training. And you can always just do a little bit of a pump up or some posing to get the blood flowing or whatever if you're worried about it. But yeah, so if I think it's going to be at all stressful for them, I will just try to get all the training done by Thursday morning, so that way they can worry about their color, they can worry about their polygraph, hotel room, getting their food in order, all that stuff, dealing with friends and family who are coming to attend when you're in a relatively already stressed state. You just want to try to make the process as simple as possible. And that's my big issue, to be honest, with the kind of traditional complex plan, is you've
Sure.
got a list of supplements you have to take to deal with a list of the side effects you've got from the list of stuff you've done. You often go from like carbohydrate depletion, like 50 grams a day, to carbohydrate loading, 600 grams a day, down to carbohydrate depletion, to then cutting sodium, potentially loading potassium, potentially changing your drugs, and then also doing things like sleeping with your feet up and your head down, and doing other dehydration techniques. Like some of the protocols I've seen would require like a 4-page pamphlet that's different than what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Um, Contrasting that with saying, hey, we're going to shift your high days to Thursday and Friday, and we're going to increase them by 20%. And then we're going to make sure that we're drinking enough water to have clear urinations. And then on game day, we're going to have something between your high day and your low day. We're going to evenly spread those meals out so they can pack. Don't worry about it. Salt each one, and then get on stage and hit your poses. And that's all we're going to do. Training, we're just going to shift back one day, and then we're going to just do a pump up, and that's it on Friday. At some point, just in the hotel room. That is something that I can fit on a half a page of paper, and it creates a whole lot less stress for the individual. Because when you as a coach, you give an assignment to someone who is super dieted after 6 months, especially if it's their first show, it all seems like it's super important. If I screw anything up, it's going to mess things
Yeah,
up. And
totally.
the more bullet points, the more opportunities for stress there are. So, and I have to say, this could be bullshit, but the more stressed bodybuilders I see, they typically look worse. I don't know if that's fight or flight response, cortisol, water retention. I could make up some physiology to try to explain that, but I won't because I could be wrong. I'll simply say that that's a consistent observation I've had is that novice bodybuilders, when they're, who tend to be more stressed and just more stressed bodybuilders in general, typically have much more unpredictability with how they look on game day. They have more GI distress. They can't sleep. They look a little off in terms of water retention. But the ones who are chill, experienced, not worrying about it, simplified plans, they tend to have a higher likelihood of looking pretty good or not looking bad at least.
I find it fascinating that this whole topic can be super complex with intracellular, extracellular, and that it's not all muscle. What about the vascular system? What about water retention? What about sodium? But at the end of the day, I think at least what I take from this is stress management. It's like the key component, right? In all its forms, in nutrition, in training, in everything, really.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And yeah, also one more thing on the, just to throw another question mark, that's really all I can do. I can't disprove some of these theories with other theories. That's not the way theories work, right? That whole intracellular, extracellular water thing, if you look at the recent case study, which I think is open access by Bearcat and colleagues, they did use BIS, multi-frequency assessment. And if you look at the intracellular to extracellular water ratio, the highest point is like 3 days out from competition. And then in competition, it's actually lower and never gets back to the baseline value. It's a little bit lower. These are small fluctuations, of course, because the body doesn't change this that much. But the proposed model would be that you would see that peak on game day when, when you've done all these manipulations, but that's not what we observe. However, the skin fold thicknesses, the sum of eight, were lowest on game day. So yeah, the intracellular extracellular water ratio, if the traditional approach does what it's supposed to, you would expect to see it being higher as skin folds were lower. But
Right.
that wasn't what was observed. The relationship wasn't there wasn't a relationship. So yeah, I think the main thing I want people to take home is if you've got this step-by-step process of how you understand that you load carbohydrate to preserve muscle size, you cut water in knowing that the glycogen is going to preserve it there, you drop sodium to excrete water, and then you're going to look great on game day because of more intracellular, less extracellular. A, that might not even be happening. B, you might not even want that to be happening. And C, it could potentially be making things worse. And the data doesn't suggest that glycogen loading preserves muscle hydration sufficiently to where you couldn't be flat. And there's other side effects from messing with electrolytes and water. So yeah, I would just say question mark. Therefore, maybe have a less extreme plan and make sure that it actually is trialed beforehand. That's probably the most important piece of practical advice I can give to anybody is practice it beforehand. Do a trial run.
And if you don't have the time to practice it, let's say you can use refit data, maintenance data, stuff like that.
Exactly. And
Right.
ideally, pick a later show so you actually can practice it. And if you can't, like you said, then repeat something that you know is going to have a reliable response.
Right. So I always question myself, do I go by Eric? I never asked you, do I go by Eric, by Dr. Helms? What do you prefer?
Eric, it's all good,
Very
man. Yeah.
very well, man. So thanks again, Eric. As I said at the beginning, it's a huge honor, a huge privilege to get to directly, well, semi-directly talk to you. And as always, anytime you want to come to Mexico, you're more than welcome. We'll be so happy to have you one day.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you so much. And
Don't
it's
want to
always
take
an
any
honor
more
to chat.
time. The
All
honor
right,
is
man. Well, I hope
I'm
this is
sorry.
useful to all your followers, dude.
Oh, you can bet it is. So thanks again. I hope you have a great rest of the day.
All right, man. Take care.
Take care, man.